The rain had just stopped in Istanbul, when the black car slowly pulled into the quiet street near the Bosphorus. The evening sky carried soft shades of silver and blue, and the city lights reflected beautifully across the water. Inside a nearby cafe, people sat quietly with warm drinks in their hands, unaware that a moment fans had imagined for months was about to happen. Elçin Sangu sat by the window wearing a long cream-colored coat, gently holding a cup of tea between her hands. She looked calm on the outside, but her thoughts were far from peaceful. For months, headlines, rumors, and endless social media discussions had surrounded her name and Barış Arduç. Every interview avoided direct answers. Every public appearance only increased curiosity. But tonight was different. Tonight, there would finally be silence between the rumors. And maybe answers between two people. Elçin glanced at her phone once more. One unread message remained open on the screen. "I'll be there at 7. We should talk." No emojis. No extra words. Just Barış. She slowly locked the screen and looked outside again. Her heartbeat became heavier with every passing minute. She had replayed this moment in her mind countless times, wondering what she would say first. Would they speak casually? Would they laugh about the past? Or would the silence between them feel too large to cross? At exactly 7 o'clock, the cafe door opened. Barış Arduç stepped inside. The room seemed to pause for a second. He wore a dark jacket, his hair slightly wet from the rain outside. He looked around carefully until his eyes found Elçin sitting near the window. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Months of distance disappeared in one silent glance. Barış slowly walked toward her table. Elçin stood up without realizing it herself. They faced each other quietly, almost surprised that the moment had finally arrived after so long. "Hi," Barış said softly. Elçin gave a small smile. "Hi." The awkwardness between them was gentle, not cold. It carried the feeling of two people who once understood each other perfectly, but had somehow lost the rhythm of communication. Barış pulled out the chair across from her and sat down carefully. "You look well," he said. "So do you." Another silence followed, but this one felt calmer. Outside, Istanbul traffic continued as usual, but inside the cafe, time felt slower. "I almost thought you wouldn't come," Elçin admitted quietly. Barış looked down for a second before answering. "I almost didn't." Her eyes softened slightly. "Why?" He leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. "Because sometimes distance becomes comfortable," he said honestly. "You tell yourself it's easier not to reopen old conversations." Elçin listened carefully. "But then," he continued, "you realize silence doesn't actually solve anything." For the first time that evening, she smiled naturally. "That sounds like something you practiced saying." Barış laughed softly. "Maybe I did." The tension between them slowly began to fade. A waiter approached their table, but both of them politely declined ordering anything else. Neither seemed interested in food or drinks. The conversation itself mattered more. For months, fans and media had created countless stories about them. Some claimed they had completely ended their friendship. Others believed there had been a secret misunderstanding. A few even imagined dramatic arguments that never truly existed. The reality was far simpler. Life had simply pulled them in different directions. Busy schedules, long filming projects, endless travel, interviews, expectations, and slowly communication became shorter, then quieter, then gone. Barış looked out the window briefly before speaking again. "I saw your interview in Madrid." Elçin raised an eyebrow. "You watched that?" "Of course. You never said anything. You never called." Her expression softened again. "Fair point." For a few seconds, both of them smiled quietly, almost realizing how unnecessary the distance between them had been. Elçin gently rested her hands on the table. "You know what hurt the most?" she asked carefully. Barış looked at her attentively. "The fact that strangers were discussing our relationship more than we were." His face changed slightly, as if the sentence reached deeper than she expected. "I know," he admitted. "I kept waiting for you to say something. I didn't know how." Elçin looked down for a moment. Outside, soft wind moved through the streets near the water. The city felt peaceful, almost protective of the private conversation happening inside the small cafe. Barış leaned slightly closer. There was never anger from my side, he said quietly. Just confusion. She looked back at him. Confusion about what? About whether you still trusted me. Elçin seemed surprised by the question. Why wouldn't I? Because the longer we stayed silent, the harder it became to reach out. She slowly nodded, finally understanding what he meant. Sometimes silence grows heavier simply because neither person knows how to break it first. For months, both of them had assumed the other no longer cared enough to reconnect. And now, sitting face to face again, they realized how wrong those assumptions had been. The cafe owner quietly lowered the music volume as more guests began leaving for the night. The atmosphere became even calmer. Barış looked around before smiling slightly. This place hasn't changed. Elçin laughed softly. You remember? You used to order the same tea every time. And you used to complain about the chairs. They're still uncomfortable. That made her laugh again, genuinely this time. And suddenly, the conversation no longer felt difficult. Felt familiar. Warm. Safe. The kind of comfort that only returns when two people truly know each other beyond headlines and public attention. Barış looked at her carefully. I missed this, he admitted. Elçin's smile slowly faded into something more emotional. Me too. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply looked at each other with quiet honesty. Months of silence could not erase years of understanding. And maybe, just maybe, this reunion was not the end of their story. Maybe it was the beginning of something new. As the lights outside reflected across the Bosphorus, Elçin quietly asked the question she had carried in her heart for months. Why did you really ask to see me tonight? Barış held her gaze for several seconds before finally answering. Because I didn't want another season of my life to pass without you in it. Elçin's eyes widened slightly. And for the first time that night, neither of them looked away. The quiet words Barış had spoken stayed in Elçin's mind long after the conversation paused. Because I didn't want another season of my life to pass without you in it. The sentence felt honest. Simple. Real. For a moment, the sounds of the cafe faded into the background. Elçin looked at him carefully, searching his expression as if trying to understand everything he had never said during those long months apart. Barış sat calmly across from her. But there was something different in his eyes tonight. The guarded distance he once carried had disappeared. In its place was sincerity, the kind that could not be hidden behind interviews, cameras, or polite public smiles. Elçin slowly looked down at the table. You really mean that? She asked softly. I wouldn't have come here if I didn't. Her heartbeat quickened slightly. The truth was she had imagined many versions of this reunion. Some emotional, some awkward, some angry. But she had never expected it to feel this gentle. Outside, light rain began falling again over Istanbul, creating soft reflections across the windows. Inside the cafe, only a few people remained now, quietly speaking among themselves. Neither Barış nor Elçin noticed them. Their attention remained completely fixed on each other. Barış folded his hands together carefully. There were so many times I wanted to call you, he admitted. More than you probably know. Then why didn't you? He smiled faintly, though it carried a little sadness. Because I kept thinking maybe you needed space. Elçin shook her head almost immediately. I didn't need space, she said quietly. I needed honesty. Those words stayed between them for several seconds. Barış nodded slowly, accepting them without defense. You're right. It was one of the things Elçin had always respected about him. When he truly listened, he never tried to turn conversations into arguments. He listened carefully, even when the truth was uncomfortable. She leaned back slightly in her chair. You know what was hardest for me? She asked. What? Pretending I wasn't affected. Barış looked at her silently. Every interview, she continued softly. Every question about you. I kept smiling like everything was normal. But it wasn't. No, she admitted. It wasn't. For months the world had watched them from a distance, trying to understand the silence between them. Fans analyzed every photo, every social media post, every public appearance. But no one truly knew how personal the silence had become. Barış lowered his gaze briefly. I hated seeing those headlines, he admitted. Elçin gave a small smile. Some of them were ridiculous. One article said we secretly argued during a film event in Paris. She laughed softly. We weren't even in Paris at the same time. Barış laughed too, and for a moment, the heaviness disappeared again. That familiar comfort returned naturally. It surprised both of them how easily they still understood each other after everything. The waiter quietly approached with fresh tea neither of them had ordered. "It's on the house," he said politely with a warm smile before leaving again. Elçin looked down at the teacup and smiled. People in this city always know when something emotional is happening. Barış looked out the window. "I think Istanbul notices everything." The rain outside became heavier now, tapping softly against the glass. For a while they simply talked. Not about fame. Not about rumors. Not about public expectations. Just life. Barış spoke about traveling for work, and how exhausting constant schedules had become. Elçin shared stories about quiet mornings she spent away from social media, and how much peace she found in ordinary moments. And slowly, the distance between them continued disappearing. At one point, Elçin noticed Barış watching her carefully again. "What?" she asked with a shy smile. He hesitated before answering. "You still do that." "Do what?" "You play with the teaspoon when you're nervous." Elçin immediately looked down and realized he was right. She laughed softly. "I didn't even notice." "I did." The small detail touched her more than she expected, because it reminded her that some connections never fully disappear. No matter how much time passes, the cafe owner eventually began stacking chairs near the far side of the room. It was getting late. Still, neither of them seemed ready to leave. Barış checked the time briefly before looking back at her. "Do you remember the night we walked near the Bosphorus after filming ended?" he asked suddenly. Elçin smiled immediately. "You got lost trying to find the car." "I was not lost." "You absolutely were." "I was exploring." She laughed again, shaking her head. "You asked 3 different people for directions. And somehow we still ended up at the wrong street." The memory brought warmth into the conversation again. For months, both of them had focused so much on the silence that they had forgotten the years of friendship, trust, and laughter that came before it. Barış became quieter after the laughter faded. "There's something I need to ask you," he said carefully. Elçin looked at him attentively. "What is it?" He hesitated for the first time that evening. And suddenly, the confidence in his voice disappeared. "When everything became quiet between us," he began slowly, "did you ever think this was the end?" The question felt heavier than anything they had discussed so far. Elçin looked out the window for a moment before answering honestly. "Yes." Barış lowered his eyes slightly. "But," she continued softly, "I didn't want it to be." He looked back at her immediately. The emotion in his expression was impossible to hide now. For months, both of them had silently feared losing something important. Not because of betrayal, not because of anger, but because neither of them knew how to stop the growing distance. Elçin gently rested her hands together. "I think we both made the same mistake," she said quietly. "What mistake?" "We waited for the other person to speak first." Barış smiled faintly. "That sounds accurate." Another comfortable silence followed. But this silence no longer felt painful. Felt healing. Outside, the rain slowly began to stop again. The streets of Istanbul reflected gold lights beneath the night sky. Barış finally stood up from his chair and looked toward the window. "Come with me," he said softly. Elçin looked surprised. "Where?" He smiled for the first time without hesitation. "To the Bosphorus." She stared at him for a second. "The rain just ended." "Exactly." For a brief moment she considered saying no. But then she remembered something important. Some moments only arrive once. And if she walked away now, she might regret it for years. Elçin slowly stood up beside him, picking up her coat. Barış looked at her quietly as she prepared to leave with him. And as they walked together toward the cafe door, neither of them noticed the older woman sitting nearby smiling softly to herself. Because sometimes, even strangers can recognize when 2 people are finally finding their way back to each other.